I don't remember where I learned it originally, but I have always been told that there are two topics which are considered rude: religion and politics. Probably that's because the arguments that happen over family dinner with that one person, which could be me, are always contentious. However, we find ourselves in interesting times. Questions of nationalism, immigration, religion, gender, sex, wealth, race, and generational differences seem to be more important in our discussions. And since we are so close to Independence Day, and we're already talking about religion, I just can't seem to avoid those topics. And this conversation is not just affecting us. Our brothers and sisters in Europe are battling these questions in the wake of the largest mass migration in human history, as well as terrorist attacks that batter against the feelings of safety and security. It's as if humanity itself is being forced to make a decision about its future and where we think that future is taking us. We just can't seem to avoid those topics. Since tomorrow is the 4th of July, we will be talking a lot about our American story. It will be on television, in the news, and at every big fireworks show that someone else puts together so you don't have to worry about burning your neighborhood down. Some will tell that story from the perspective of their family because their family has been here since the very beginning. Others will tell that story on a grand scale to show how the American narrative impacts global events. A few will tell that story from the perspective of the church and how our quests to live our understandings of faithfulness have brought us to this place we now call home. All of them are American stories. But how we tell these stories is very important. The images we use and the points we highlight are key. There are so many things in our history to talk about that we could never put them all in one story. So how we tell that story is very important. As we look at the gospel story today, we enter into a scene where Jesus is confronted with the stories of Israel and his people, the Jews, and how their story is told. Palestine of Jesus' day was a place of focused tension. For generations, the Jews had gone from being ruled by one empire after another, frequently rebelling to varying degrees of effect. Now, this empire of Gentiles from Rome sits above them, installing puppet kings to take their money and load their backs with the weight of servitude. Over time, the society fragments into a spectrum of responses to their Roman masters. Groups like the Herodians and the Sadducees supported Rome because it benefited them and kept them in their positions, while the Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots supported Jewish independence with increasing degrees of violence. So when the Pharisees and Herodians team up to come and question Jesus, it is odd. These groups are diametrically opposed to one another. They tell their story from different perspectives. The Herodians support the vassal King Herod and his sons, who aren't even Jewish. They get perks from the court and skim from some of the taxes while turning their noses to many in the streets. Often they are informants for the empire, passing information on secret cabals of social agitators who threaten the peace of Rome. While the Pharisees are teachers from the countryside. They have no real power in the capital, Jerusalem, at least not in comparison to the Sadducees, who are their religious counterpart. The small towns outside of Jerusalem are where the rebellions began. Many of the people called Messiah during the time of Roman occupation would come from there. The Pharisees represent the religious will of such rebellions. According to Mark, they gathered this motley crew together and sent them to question Jesus. They seem to have found a threat they can mutually oppose. They seem to be very influential, whoever they are. The Jesus followers seem to be this group that is coming together and taking influence from all sides. They have the perfect question for this rabbi from Nazareth. The hick from the Sea of Galilee will never see it coming. "Rabbi," they say in order to butter him up, "we know you are one who doesn't choose sides. You just teach the truth. So we want to know if we should pay taxes to this emperor." I'm sure one of the disciples sitting there, soaking up the teachings of their rabbi, thought the words that would later be immortalized by George Lucas 2 millennia later. It's a trap. Jesus is trapped. There is no good answer to this question. It's the religio-political equivalent of, "So are you still beating your spouse?" Either response gets him in trouble with some group. He will be discredited to some segment of the population of Palestine, and there is a distinct possibility that his response can put his life and the lives of his followers in danger. The Herodians and the Pharisees have finally got him. Finally, after all of the trouble that he has been giving them, they will finally be able to take that pesky rabbi from the north out of the equation. The stress he had been putting on their society will finally be rubbed out, and they can get back to dividing up the pie the way they see fit. Or, that's how it should have gone. Instead, the evangelist tells us that he knew the hypocrisy in their hearts. Maybe he knew that there were no true convictions among them, but instead were writing the popular sentiment of their constituencies. Perhaps these Pharisees were just tapping into the anger and resentment that had been a part of the countryside for generations. Maybe these Herodians were just taking up with the people who could make them the most money. Either way, we are told that Jesus knew, and so his response is meant to highlight their motives. "Bring me a coin from this government." And of course, someone has the denarius handy. "Oh, I have one," someone might have said. "Who's on that coin? What's that person's title? It's just on the tip of my tongue, but I can't remember." Maybe Jesus responded just to drag out the moment. "It's Caesar." Historical research into the world of the first century tells us that in order to pay taxes, a Roman subject would declare, "Caesar is Lord." Often it was put on the coin itself. Jesus' last line is the walk-off that ends the game. Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and give to God the things that are God's. They are amazed because in one small exchange, Jesus highlights the hypocrisy he knows is inherent to the question. They are breaking the second commandment of the law of Moses. They presume to trap Jesus when they themselves are trapped by their own stories. Every time I hear the song "America the Beautiful," I'm reminded of a scene from the movie The Sandlot. It's the one where they try to play a night baseball game in the lights of exploding fireworks. And underneath the scene, Ray Charles's version of "America the Beautiful" plays. I asked Louise to sing it like Ray Charles this Sunday, and she told me no. But many times we don't sing the third verse, although we did today. But I wonder if you have ever heard some of the words and meditated on them. For instance, "O beautiful for heroes proved in liberating strife, who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life." The images generated by the lyrics are meant to invoke the sacrifice of those who gave their lives for the foundation of the United States. It's an image that begs a sense of thankfulness from us. But it has its basis in violent conflict. Have we likewise raised any meditations or had any meditations on our own national anthem, especially over such lyrics as, "And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there"? Francis Scott Key paints a vivid image of the Battle of Fort McHenry, where the artillery shells from British ships in Baltimore Harbor batter the American defenses, pounding on the walls and taking human lives. This is where I feel the need to qualify and apologize for what I am saying. I'm not asking us to hate our country. I know that the foundational documents of the U.S. are what allow me to say the things I am saying without the vengeance of an offended government. But I think we do have to confront and deal with our national images, especially when we who are so bold to call ourselves Christians are asked to participate in our social mechanisms. It's truly a question of how we tell our story. When we tell it in song, we are able to create images in music and lyric that allow us to paint beautiful pictures of what were truly grisly events. It's like reading the story of Noah to a child. We focus on the cuteness of the animals and maybe a grumpy Noah trying to get 2 donkeys up the ramp onto the ark. But when it comes to talking about the wholesale destruction of humanity from the face of the planet, we move on rather quickly. Our national images and our story is one that has a lot of violence in it. How we tell that story is important. When I was in seminary, I took a class called Philosophy of Religion. Our professor was the prototypical image of a man who spent all of his time reading books. He was rather soft-spoken, and I remember that for most of that semester he had tape holding the leg of his glasses on. The week before finals, I remember looking over and that tape was gone. And when I asked him what happened, he said, "Oh, these are my new glasses. My wife said I wasn't allowed to wear the ones with the tape anymore." I was still having a hard time telling the difference between the new glasses and the old glasses. The point is, however, that during the class, the professor chose to shape the course by using a historical timeline. As we moved closer to our present, he would introduce the different eras of philosophical thought, give us the names and some of the readings of the most influential writers of the time, and then have us debate the issues that brought about this new shift in thinking. Eventually, we got to our present era of philosophy, and at the time, the actual name for it itself, postmodern, was an interesting phrase that made no sense to most of us, and for some was something of a profane word. The first day when we decided to confront this new nemesis, we had to try and define postmodern. And that just caused all kinds of arguments. People said it just meant everything was relative, or there were no more rules. What I really remember, however, was this one definition that the quietest student in the class gave. She hadn't spoken much in the discussions and always stayed out of the arguments, which incidentally was where you could often find me. But what she said stunned the room to silence that day. She told us, postmodern philosophy is philosophy that is aware of itself. Now that day in class, her saying sounded more mystical than philosophic, and so we didn't really pay it much attention. However, that night, I remember tossing those words around in my head for a long time until I was finally able to grasp what she meant. For the first time, philosophers were aware that there were other people from other countries who spoke different languages or participated in different academic disciplines, like science, that were participating in these same conversations. And because they were aware of how big the conversation really was, they who had been so influential for so long had to look back and really examine the words they had used. It is philosophy that had become aware of how interconnected everything truly was. It is philosophy that must look for and wrestle with its biases and cultural lenses. When I read this passage from Mark for the first time after that, these words came rushing back to me like a tidal wave. Jesus is highlighting the biases of the Pharisees and Herodians by making them look at the coin It was an image, it has an image scratched into it, and the image is of someone who says they are God. The Jews standing there are reminded of their own faith and forced to tell their story from a different perspective. What does it mean to have a coin with the image of someone who calls themselves a God when the text that forms the foundation of your faith says, "You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall have no graven image"? In this time, in this place, with all of these stresses on us, when we tell our story as followers of Jesus in America, how we tell our story is very important. And what we choose to be the thing which influences that telling is very important. When we tell our story, do we tell it from the perspective that uses violence, similar to building a cross to respond to challenges? Or do we tell it from the perspective of one who bears crosses? Which perspective we choose is important. In the first story, the narrative starts at the pinnacle that is the birth of a nation and becomes a continual set of scenes where we have had to refocus on our beginnings and our original goal. From the perspective of the second, it is one that doesn't necessarily see the beginning as the best of who we could be. We can tell a story, but it allows us to tell a story of a gospel that is growing, one that is becoming more aware of itself, and how we are not the only ones telling stories. The perspective from which we tell our story is just as important, maybe more important than the story we tell, as long as the perspective is that which builds crosses. We will forever be trapped in the hypocrisy of our own violence, just like the Pharisees and Herodians. When we can tell the story from the perspective of the one who bears crosses, we could never hate anyone or anything. But we can confess that we haven't always been perfect or made the best choices. We can confess that we are getting better, but that we are both sinner and saint. When our stories are from the perspective of the one who bears crosses, we can give so much more grace to those who don't like our story. In essence, we can see that there are better days ahead and not behind, that the Spirit of God marches before us, and that our banner is headed that way. Amen.